The Interstellar Hazard Assessment Division had a lovely little system for rating planetary hospitality. Class 1 worlds were resort destinations, where the biggest threat was sunburn and maybe a hangover. Class 0 worlds were the universe's way of saying abandon all hope in 14,000 languages, most of which were screams. Valdros Prime held the distinguished honor of being the only planet to ever receive a Class 2 Delta rating, which was bureaucrat speak for we ran out of ways to say absolutely not and had to invent new ones. The planet's entry in the database was essentially a very polite way of saying nope in every font size available. But here's the thing about interstellar bureaucracy. It's staffed by beings who think the height of danger is a paper cut, and they have an impressive talent for filing the wrong paperwork at exactly the wrong time. Which is how Lyra Blackwood's cargo manifest ended up listing her destination as Valdros Prime, Sector 7, Class 1 Recreation World, instead of Valdros Station, Sector 7, Class 1 Space Station. One tiny clerical error. One misplaced hyphen. One cosmic joke that would have been hilarious if it weren't happening to her. Lyra had been hauling cargo across the galaxy for 12 years, developing a healthy respect for Murphy's Law and an unhealthy relationship with instant coffee. Her ship, the Stellar Drift, was a modified Kestrel-class freighter that held together through maintenance nanobots, prayer, and sheer stubborn refusal to die. The warning signs were there. The navigation computer kept throwing error messages about insufficient atmospheric data and extreme biohazard detected. The long-range sensors registered life signs that made the computer's threat assessment algorithms weep digital tears. Even the ship's AI kept making passive-aggressive comments about updating life insurance policies. But Lyra was on a deadline, the pay was decent, and she'd learned that space travel was 90% routine and 10% absolute terror. She should have thought harder. The first sign that something was cosmically wrong came when she dropped out of hyperspace and registered atmospheric readings that looked like they'd been designed by a sadistic chemist. The second sign was when proximity alarms screamed warnings about massive predatory life forms. The third sign was when something the size of a small moon with entirely too many teeth decided her ship looked tasty. The hull breach happened so fast that Lyra barely had time to register the impact before fighting to keep her ship from becoming expensive space debris. The descent was less controlled landing and more barely controlled falling with style. When the world stopped spinning, Lyra took stock. Her ship was now a smoking wreck that would never see the stars again. Long-range communications were dead. Her emergency beacon was broadcasting to no one because Valdros Prime scrambled electromagnetic signals like eggs at a particularly vindictive breakfast. She was alone on a Class 10 Deathworld where the trees probably had teeth and the flowers definitely had opinions about her continued existence. The air was technically breathable, assuming you enjoyed breathing humid soup made of trace toxins and decomposing something. The temperature hovered around uncomfortably warm, with spikes into mildly hellish. The local flora pulsed ominously, as if the planet had a heartbeat and was experiencing tachycardia. But hey, at least the gravity was only 20% higher than Earth's standard. Small mercies in large disasters. But hey, at least the gravity was only 20% higher than Earth standard. Small mercies. Lyra spent her first day cataloguing supplies, reinforcing her makeshift shelter in the ship's cargo bay and trying very hard not to think about the fact that the planet's background noise included sounds that no planet should make. Chittering that suggested things with far too many legs were having conversations about lunch. Roars that implied the local predators were roughly the size of small buildings, and underneath it all, a constant, almost subsonic thrumming that made her teeth ache and her survival instincts scream for her to dig a hole and hide until the heat death of the universe. The second day brought visitors. First, something that looked like a spider crossed with a bad decision, with legs that moved in patterns that hurt to watch. It tested her defenses for 20 minutes before deciding the metal box wasn't worth the effort. Second, a flying jellyfish hang glider hybrid with anger management issues. It circled for hours before concluding she wasn't worth the calories. Third, a pack of knot-wolves that moved with fluid grace, making soft chittering sounds that might have been communication or meal planning discussions. They didn't attack immediately. Instead, they watched and waited and made soft chittering sounds that might have been communication or might have been the sound of predators discussing the best way to open a particularly stubborn can of human. It was during this delightful standoff that Lyra first became aware she was being studied by something much larger and infinitely more dangerous than the pack of knot-wolves. The feeling started as a prickle between her shoulder blades, the kind of sensation that came from being watched by something that considered you about as threatening as a particularly slow-moving appetizer. The knot-wolves felt it too. Their chittering stopped abruptly, and they began looking around with a kind of nervous energy that suggested they'd just realized they might not be the biggest predators in the immediate area. The forest went quiet, not the peaceful quiet of a lazy afternoon, but the kind of quiet that happened when everything with a functioning survival instinct decided that making noise was a spectacularly bad idea. Then the trees started moving, not swaying in the wind. There wasn't any wind. Moving. Deliberately, with purpose, with the kind of fluid, predatory grace that suggested they weren't trees at all, but something that had decided that looking like trees was an excellent way to get close to unsuspecting prey. The knot-wolves bolted. Whatever had been circling overhead departed with such speed that it left a small sonic boom in its wake. Even the plants seemed to be trying to make themselves less noticeable, and into this tableau of universal terror stepped something that made Lyra's brain struggle to process exactly what she was looking at. It was big, not just large, but big in the way that made adjectives inadequate, and forced the mind to reach for entirely new categories of, "Oh, that's not good." It moved through the forest like liquid shadow, each step perfectly silent despite its obvious mass. Its form seemed to shift and flow as if it existed in several dimensions simultaneously, and her three-dimensional perception could only catch glimpses of the whole. The eyes were the worst part. They weren't just intelligent, they were ancient, patient, and utterly alien. They looked at her with the kind of assessment that suggested they could see not just her physical form, but her intentions, her fears, her entire genetic history, and possibly her browser history as well. This, Lyra realized with the kind of crystalline clarity that came from being absolutely certain you were about to die, was Valdros Prime's apex predator. This was the thing that made everything else on this nightmare world look like harmless garden creatures by comparison. The creature, she decided to call it Karath because that thing that's probably about to eat me seemed unwieldy, studied her for what felt like several geological epochs, but was probably only a few minutes. Its head tilted in a manner that was almost curious, almost thoughtful, and definitely calculating. Then it did something that made Lyra's understanding of predatory behavior take a small vacation to a nice beach somewhere, far from this particular reality. It settled down, right there, about 50 meters from her crash site, like a cat claiming a sunny spot. If cats were the size of small buildings and had the kind of presence that made reality itself seem a little less stable, and it watched. Not with the focused intensity of a predator sizing up prey, but with something that looked disturbingly like interest. The next morning, Lyra woke to find a dead thing outside her shelter. Not just any dead thing, but one of the knot-wolves that had been stalking her the previous day. It had been killed with surgical precision, one clean strike that had ended its life so quickly it probably hadn't had time to realize it was dead. It was an offering, a gift, a statement that said quite clearly, "You are under my protection now." This was either the beginning of a beautiful friendship or the most elaborate method of food preparation in the known galaxy. Lyra chose to believe it was the former, mostly because the alternative involved too much psychological trauma for a Tuesday morning. Lyra chose to believe it was the former, mostly because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate, and she was running low on alternatives anyway. The pattern established itself over the following days. Korath would maintain a watchful distance during the day, close enough to intervene if any of the planet's other delightful inhabitants decided to test their luck, but far enough away to avoid making Lyra feel like she was sharing her space with a natural disaster. At night, he would settle into what appeared to be a comfortable watching position and simply watch. It should have been terrifying. It was terrifying. But it was also, in a weird way, reassuring, because nothing else on Valdros Prime was brave enough or stupid enough to approach anything that Karath was actively guarding. The real breakthrough came when Lyra started talking to him. She'd always been a talker when she was nervous, and being stranded on a Deathworld with only an apex predator for company definitely qualified as nervous-making. She started with simple observations about the weather, terrible, the local wildlife, creative in its desire to kill her, and her situation, somewhere between dire and cosmically unfair. Korath listened. More than that, he responded. Not with words, obviously, but with body language that suggested he was not only understanding her, but finding her commentary somewhat amusing. When she complained about the humidity, he shifted position in what looked like agreement. When she described the flying jellyfish thing as nature's way of saying "fuck you" to the concept of aerodynamics, something that might have been a rumble of laughter vibrated through his massive form. The first time she made him laugh, actually laugh, with a sound like distant thunder mixed with something that might have been mirth, Lyra realized that she wasn't just surviving on Valdros Prime. She was living here. And she wasn't alone. It became a routine. Mornings were for scavenging supplies from her wrecked ship and making improvements to her shelter. Afternoons were for exploring the immediate area under Korath's watchful protection, learning which plants were merely toxic versus actively hostile, and figuring out how to process the planet's water supply into something that wouldn't dissolve her kidneys. Evenings were for conversation, one-sided though it might be, where she would tell Korath about her life, her travels, her thoughts on the cosmic unfairness of bureaucratic incompetence, and gradually she began to understand that Korath was doing more than just protecting her. He was studying her, learning about her, the way she moved, the way she thought, the way she approached problems. He would bring her things, not just food, but objects that seemed to puzzle him, pieces of technology from her ship, crystalline formations that responded to her bioelectric field, plants that seemed to have properties that might be useful to a small, soft, ridiculously fragile creature trying to survive on a world that wanted to kill her. He was, she realized, taking care of her. Not just as a protector, but as a caretaker. She had somehow become his responsibility, his charge, his pet wasn't the right word. Ward, maybe. Or possibly something closer to a beloved and slightly incompetent dependent who required constant supervision to avoid accidentally killing herself. The relationship was working out better than most of her previous relationships, which said something either about her taste in partners or about the quality of apex predators as companions. 3 months into her unscheduled residency on Valdros Prime, Lyra had established what could generously be called a comfortable routine. Her shelter had evolved from barely adequate to actually livable, thanks to a combination of salvaged ship components and materials that Korath had somehow procured. She had a reliable water source, a sustainable food supply that only occasionally tried to eat her back, and a roommate who was unfailingly polite, never left dirty dishes in the sink, and could deter unwanted visitors with extreme prejudice. She had also developed a communication system with Korath that was surprisingly sophisticated. It involved a combination of gestures, sounds, and what she was beginning to suspect was a form of limited telepathy that worked best when they were both relaxed and not thinking too hard about it. They could discuss abstract concepts, share observations about the local environment, and even engage in what could only be described as philosophical debates about the nature of survival and adaptation. It was during one of these conversations that Lyra first broached the subject of his intelligence. "You know," she said, settling into her usual evening position on a flat rock that Korath had carefully positioned for her comfort, "for something that's supposed to be a mindless killing machine, you sure ask a lot of interesting questions." Korath's response was a complex combination of sounds and movements that roughly translated to amusement mixed with mild offense at being called mindless. "Sorry," she said, grinning. "Mindful killing machine, better?" This time the response was definitely laughter. "I've been thinking," she continued, "about what you are, what this place is. The interstellar databases classify Valdros Prime as a Class T Deathworld, but they don't really explain why. They just list it as extremely hostile to most known forms of life and leave it at that." Korath's attention sharpened. She could feel his interest like a physical weight. "But you're not hostile. Not to me, anyway. You're protective, careful, you think before you act, you solve problems. You're not just apex predator, you're a person, aren't you?" The silence stretched between them, filled with the background sounds of a world that was learning to be less terrible in their immediate vicinity. Finally, Korath moved, a complex gesture that conveyed agreement, acknowledgement, and something that might have been gratitude for being recognized as more than just a force of nature. "So the question becomes," Lyra said, "what does a person like you think about a person like me? Am I your pet, your ward, your friend?" The response was immediate and complex, involving what felt like several different emotional concepts layered together. But the dominant theme was clear. She was precious, valuable, worth protecting, not just because she was weak, but because she was unique, interesting, and had somehow earned his respect and affection. She was, in other words, family. "Well," Lyra said, feeling something warm and complicated settle in her chest, "I guess that makes this home. And it might have stayed that way, if not for the rescue team that arrived 4 months later." The ship descended through Valdros Prime's atmosphere like a falling star, its hull scarred from the journey but intact enough to maintain controlled flight. It was a military vessel, sleek and purposeful, with the kind of weapons array that suggested its designers had strong opinions about hostile environments and the things that lived in them. Lyra watched it approach from her vantage point on the ridge above her shelter, Korolth's massive presence beside her radiating a tension that made the air itself feel dangerous. This was his territory, his domain, and these newcomers were uninvited guests with unknown intentions. The ship landed in a clearing about 2 kilometers from her crash site, and within minutes figures in environmental suits were spreading out in a standard search pattern. Their movements were efficient, professional, and absolutely confident in their ability to handle whatever this world might throw at them. They had clearly never met Korath. The first team to approach her shelter did so with the kind of cautious optimism that suggested they actually expected to find her alive, which was more confidence than Lyra had had in her own survival prospects when she'd first arrived. They called out her name, announced themselves as a rescue team from the Terran Colonial Authority, and generally behaved like people who had done this sort of thing before. They also moved like people who had no idea they were being stalked by something that could end their existence with about as much effort as swatting a fly. "Lyra Blackwood," the team leader's voice crackled through her suit's external speakers, "we're here to get you out of here. Are you injured? Are you alone?" Lyra looked at Korath, who had positioned himself in the shadows where he could observe without being seen. His eyes were fixed on the newcomers with an intensity that made her survival instinct scream warnings about incoming violence. "I'm fine," she called back, stepping out from behind her shelter. "And no, I'm not alone." The team leader, Commander Thex, according to the name stenciled on her suit, visibly relaxed. "Thank God. We weren't sure. This place has a reputation. How have you survived here for 4 months?" "I had help," Lyra said, glancing meaningfully at the shadows where Korath waited. "Help? From who? Were there other survivors from your crash?" "Not exactly." Lyra took a deep breath. "Commander, I need you to understand something. This planet isn't what the databases say it is. It's not just a death world. It's inhabited by intelligent life, and that life has been protecting me." She could practically hear the skepticism in the commander's voice. "Protecting you? From what?" "From everything else that wants to eat me. Which, on this planet, is pretty much everything." "Ms. Blackwood," Commander Thex said with the kind of patience that suggested she'd dealt with traumatized survivors before, "I understand that isolation can play tricks on the mind, but we need to get you out of here. This planet is extremely dangerous, and we can't stay long." "I know it's dangerous," Lyra said, "but I also know that I've been living here safely for months because I'm under the protection of this world's apex predator. and he's not going to be happy about uninvited guests. Apex Predator? This from a new voice. Dr. Kelvani, the team's xenobiologist. You mean you've had contact with the dominant species? Contact is an understatement, Lyra said. We've been roommates, and that was when Korath decided to make his entrance. He didn't emerge from the shadows so much as become visible, like a piece of the world itself had decided to take form and express an opinion about the current situation. The rescue team's confident professionalism evaporated in the face of something that was clearly, obviously, and definitely not supposed to exist. Holy shit, someone whispered over the comm. Fall back, Commander Thex ordered. Defensive positions, do not engage unless… No, Lyra said, stepping between them and Korath. Nobody moves, nobody raises weapons, nobody does anything threatening. As Blackwood, get away from that thing immediately. His name is Korath, Lyra said. And he's not a thing, he's a person, and right now, he's deciding whether you're a threat to me. Korath's attention was fixed on the rescue team with the kind of focus that suggested he was calculating angles, distances, and the approximate time it would take to reduce them to their component atoms. His massive form seemed to fill the space around them, making the air itself feel heavier. Everyone stay calm, Lyra said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent months learning to read the moods of an apex predator. Korath, they're here to help, they're not enemies. The creature's massive head turned toward her, and she could feel the weight of his attention like a physical force. His response was a complex sound that conveyed skepticism, protectiveness, and a strong desire to remove these intruders from his territory. I know, she said, but they're my people. They came looking for me because they were worried. This seemed to give Korath pause. His posture shifted slightly, becoming marginally less overtly threatening and more merely impossibly dangerous. Can you understand it? Dr. Kelvani asked, her scientific curiosity apparently outweighing her survival instincts. We can communicate, Lyra said. It's complicated, but yes, we understand each other. This is unprecedented. Dr. Kelvani breathed. First contact with a Class 10 apex predator. The xenobiological implications alone. Dr. Kelvani, Commander Thex said sharply. This is a rescue mission, not a research expedition. Miss Blackwood, we need to leave. Now. What if I don't want to leave? The question hung in the air like a particularly awkward silence at a dinner party. Commander Thex's helmet turned toward Lyra with the kind of motion that suggested she was reconsidering her assessment of the situation. I'm sorry, what? I said, what if I don't want to leave? I've built a life here. I have a home. I have… She looked at Korath, who was watching the exchange with obvious interest. I have family. You have Stockholm Syndrome, Commander Thex said firmly. That thing is a predator. It's been keeping you alive for its own purposes, whatever those might be. His purposes, Lyra corrected, are to keep me safe and happy. Which he's been doing remarkably well, thank you very much. Ms. Blackwood, you're not thinking clearly. This planet is listed as Class 12 for a reason. It's not safe for human habitation. It's not safe for unprepared humans, Lyra said. But I'm not unprepared anymore. I know how to live here. I know the rules. I know what's dangerous and what isn't. And I know that Korath has been taking better care of me than most of the galaxy ever has. She turned to address Korath directly. They want me to leave with them, to go back to the rest of human space. What do you think? Gor's response was immediate and complex. He understood the concept of her leaving, and he understood that it would be her choice. But he also conveyed with surprising clarity that he would prefer she stay, that he had grown attached to her presence, her conversations, her unique perspective on the world they shared, that he would miss her. He says it's my choice, Lyra translated, but he'd rather I stayed. And what's your choice? Dr. Kelvani asked softly. Lyra looked around at the world that had tried to kill her, then learned to protect her, at the shelter that had become a home, at the apex predator who had become a friend, protector, and family. I think, she said, that home is where someone gives a damn whether you live or die. And for the first time in my life, I'm not just surviving somewhere. I'm living here. I'm valued here. I'm happy here. She turned back to Commander Thex. I appreciate you coming to rescue me, really. but I don't need rescuing anymore." "This is insane," Commander Thex said. "You can't just stay here. You're human. You belong with other humans." "Do I?" Lyra asked. "Because I've spent 12 years hauling cargo between human colonies, and not once has anyone cared about me the way Korath has. Not once has anyone gone out of their way to keep me safe, to make sure I was comfortable, to actually listen to what I had to say." She gestured to the world around them. "This planet tried to kill me when I first arrived, but it learned better. It adapted. It found a way to make me part of its ecosystem. When's the last time human space did that for anyone?" The silence stretched between them, filled with the sounds of a world that was no longer quite so hostile in their immediate vicinity. Finally, Dr. Kelvani spoke. Would you be willing to serve as a liaison between human space and Korath's people?" "His people?" Lyra asked. "There have to be others like him. This level of intelligence, this capacity for communication. We could be looking at an entire civilization that we've written off as just another Deathworld." Lyra looked at Korath, who was following the conversation with obvious interest. "What do you think? Are there others like you?" His response was complex, involving concepts of territory, society, and communication networks that spanned the planet. Yes, there were others. Many others. And they had been watching the small, soft creatures from the stars with curiosity and caution for longer than human civilization had existed. "He says yes," Lyra said. "There are others, and they've been watching us." "Then this changes everything," Dr. Kelvani said. "First contact protocols, diplomatic considerations, the entire classification system for worlds like this. Thing at a time," Commander Thex said. "Ms. Blackwood, if you're determined to stay here, we can't force you to leave. But we can establish a communication relay, regular check-ins, a way for you to contact us if you change your mind." "That would be good," Lyra said. "And maybe we can work out some kind of exchange program. People who want to learn about this world, about Korath's people, people who might be interested in a different way of living. Assuming they don't get eaten immediately," Commander Thex said dryly. "Oh, they probably will," Lyra said cheerfully, "unless they're under protection, which would be up to Korath and his people to decide." She looked at her protector, her friend, her family. "What do you think? Ready to meet the neighbors?" Korath's response was the sound of distant thunder, mixed with something that might have been laughter. It conveyed amusement, interest, and a healthy skepticism about the wisdom of most soft creatures, who thought they could survive on his world, but it also conveyed a willingness to try. "I think," Lyra said, "this is going to be the beginning of a very interesting chapter in interstellar history." The rescue team departed 2 days later, leaving behind a communication relay, a promise to return with diplomatic personnel, and a set of reports that would probably give the Interstellar Classification Bureau nightmares for decades to come. Lyra watched their ship disappear into the toxic clouds of Valdros Prime's atmosphere, then turned to Korath. "So," she said, "what do you want to do today?" His response was a complex sound that conveyed contentment, curiosity, and anticipation for whatever adventures the day might bring. It was the sound of someone who had found their place in the universe and was looking forward to sharing it with others. It was, in other words, the sound of home. The Interstellar Hazard Assessment Division would eventually reclassify Valdros Prime from a Class 12 Death World to a Class 12 Diplomatic World, which was their way of saying, still extremely dangerous, but now we have to be polite about it. The bureaucrats who had made the original filing error were quietly reassigned to jobs that didn't involve potential diplomatic incidents with apex predators. And somewhere in the growing archives of interspecies communication, there was a small note that read, "Human survival on hostile worlds, significantly improved when local apex predators are treated as individuals rather than obstacles. Further research recommended," which was, perhaps, the most profound understatement in the history of interstellar relations. But then the universe had always had a sense of humor about these things. It just usually kept it to itself.